Hello everyone, this is the lesson 2 of Unit 3. In this lesson we are going to talk about Palestine, Korea and Congo, the crises that happened in end of 1940s, beginning of 1950s and beginning of 1960s. First we are going to look at the Palestine. So we have to understand why there was a conflict in Palestine in the first place. We have to understand the actions taken by the United Nations to deal with the Palestinian conflict. So we are interested in how United Nations tried to solve this international crisis. And the third one is explaining the significance of the Palestinian conflict for the United Nations. Why was it significant? And the same type of objectives will be for Korea and for Congo crisis as well. So, the conflict in Palestine. Now, you have to know the background history of Palestine. I'd suggest that you watch a few videos on YouTube about history of Palestine. Palestine used to be the part of the Ottoman Empire, which basically existed from 12th century till 20th century. But after the First World War, the Ottoman Empire collapsed, and the Arab populated lands on the Ottoman Empire's territories were put under the League of Nations Mandate Commission. Palestine fell under the control of Britain. If you remember, League of Nations Mandate Commission, mostly Arabic lands were divided between Britain and France. And for example, Syria and Lebanon were given to France, whereas Palestine and Jordan were given, and Iraq were given to the United Kingdom. As the British encouraged Jewish immigration to Palestine, it caused more tensions with the Arabic population. Now, I'll not go deep into that. There are many documents where historical sources where it is talking about how the British encouraged Jewish population to move into Palestine. There's a Balfour Declaration, there's Sykes-Picot Agreement, but we will not delve deep in that. We'll keep it short and simple. So, in 1930s, during the times when Nazi Germany was evolving, Hitler came to power, and the Holocaust happened during the Second World War. More and more calls would be heard for the Jews to have their own homeland, because there was the Jewish population in Europe, in America, everywhere around the globe, but there was no any homeland for Jewish population to settle down. And they started calling their homeland Palestine. Historically, Palestine, you could search the very existence of Palestinian lands in the Bible, in the Jewish holy books. So yes, it goes that deep. When 100,000 Jewish settlers tried to move to Palestine in 1945, that is after the Holocaust happened, and people wanted to find a safe haven to start from scratch again, the British had to refuse due to the discontent from the Arabic population, because if you look at the percentages, after the First World War, Palestine was mostly populated by Arabic population, but less by the original local Jewish population. But then during the movement of the Jewish settlers, the Arabic population decreased, and the proportions changed, and the number of Jewish settlers increased. And this caused potential crisis, conflict, clash between the Arabic and the coming Jewish population. And the British had somehow had to say to stop to this, but it turned violent. There was a terror attack against British officers in Palestine. Yes, the Jewish terrorist campaign against the British and against the Arabic population started fighting back. So in 1948, there was such a situation where Britain could not hold Palestine together, And it's also the time when Britain gave independence to India. So Britain was slowly decolonizing, leaving its colonies and mandates and going back to controlling, so establishing British Commonwealth and not just owning the colonies. In 1948, Britain left Palestine, and of course, they couldn't just leave Palestinian population of Arabs and Jewish fighting against each other. They had to ask someone to intervene, and this was the UN. And UN was asked to solve the conflict um, left behind by the British. So, after being asked, the UN intervened into Palestinian affairs and tried to solve the crisis, and they came up with the partition plan. Now, the United Nations realized that if the proportion of the Jewish and Arabic population in Palestine is almost equal, then they would need two countries. So it's better to split Palestine into two and have two countries: the country of Palestine, where the Arabs would live, and the country of Israel, where the Jewish would live. But the problem was that there was the city of Jerusalem, and Jerusalem was, let's say, even today, it's the center of all three religions: Christianity, Judaism, Islam, and people would not easily give up the city. So the partition plan was meant to split Palestine in such a way that the Arab and Jewish population would not fight over Jerusalem. So UN mediator is someone who is the third party who's trying to solve the problem between the first and second parties. So Count Folke Bernadotte of Sweden, he was present in Palestine to try to solve the problem, but he was murdered in Palestine and things got worse. And after that, the things got out of control of the United Nations and the war started. The war of 1948-49, the first Israeli-Palestinian war. Please remember the years. 1948, 1949, the first Israeli-Palestinian wars, because there will be second and third we will study in the next units. So the United Nations quickly passed a resolution 194, asking for refugees to return home, asking for refugees to be compensated for the loss of property if they decide not to return home, Jerusalem to be demilitarized and be independent. And in 1949, Israel joined the United Nations. But Palestine refused to accept, Palestinian Arabs refused to accept the partition plan. So Palestine was not recognized as a country, whereas Israel was fully recognized country by the majority of the UN members, except the Arabic population who were trying to show the solidarity with Palestinian people. So Israeli-Palestinian war was not precisely Israel versus Palestinian Arabs. It was also other Arabic countries being involved in this war, but Israel was stronger. So in the first Israeli-Palestinian war, Israel won, Palestine lost, and that created more problems for the Arabic population. This is on the picture you can see the UN partition of Palestine plan. Please have a look at it. The colored territory that you see, it's Palestine. As you can see, it's bordering with Egypt and Transjordan, which is today's Jordan, and Syria and Lebanon. Now, look at the blue areas, which are the Jewish territory. Look at the purple areas, which are the Gaza Strip, West Bank, the West Bank of the River Jordan, and the Golan Heights, which in 1949, by the end of the war, was what was left out of Palestine. And you can look at the Jerusalem, find the Jerusalem, which is in the West Bank territory, but Jerusalem was very disputed. So both Jewish and Arabic population claimed Jerusalem. So Jerusalem became an international city under UN authority, according to the partition plan. But at the moment, it's not the case. Jewish state, if you look at it, please, on the left-hand key of the map, Jewish state Israel, it covered 56% of the Palestine, whereas Palestinian state covered only 44. The population, please look and compare the population. Jewish were around 500,000 in Israel and 325,000 Arabs. So the ratio in Israel was 60% versus 40% of Jewish Arabic population. And in the Arabic side, the Palestinian side, it's 98.8, almost 99% Arabic population, and just 1.2% Jewish population. So, the significance of the United Nations in Palestine now. This was the first time UN was asked to intervene in a dispute. After the Second World War, after the establishment of the United Nations, this was the first threat to international peace and security, and UN was asked, and it had to intervene, and it did intervene. So remember, Israeli-Palestinian War number 1, 1948-49, is the first time UN was asked to intervene in a dispute. This is also UN's first peacekeeping force deployment to the region. UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian Refugees was established in 1949 to help those refugees who lost their homes and could not return back, and they needed humanitarian help. Then UN passed resolutions without a veto. However, this was not enough to guarantee a successful outcome, because resolutions did not bind Israel to move out of the lands that it has taken. So technically resolutions were there, but the problem still exists. So if you look at, we are now in the year 2020, and Israeli-Palestinian conflict is still ongoing. This is it for now. We will come back to Israeli-Palestinian conflict in the next unit, in Unit 4. Just remember the background information that you have learned today. The second conflict that we are going to learn today is the Korean War, 1950 and 53. Korean War is the first globalized event of the Cold War. So till 1949, Cold War was happening on the European territory between USA and USSR, but influenced countries were the Western and Eastern European countries. But in 1949, when China turned communist, People's Republic of China was established, things have changed. And from that time on, the Cold War globalized. It became a global problem, and USA and USSR now were involved everywhere around the globe. And they started from Korea. So what has happened is that, if you remember, we discussed it when we studied the Cold War, that Truman made a speech in the Congress and talked about the loss of China, in quotation marks. He said, we lost China. We cannot afford losing South Korea, so we have to contain communism in South Korea. And Korea by that time was already divided. So let's look at the background history, conflict in Korea. So after the Second World War, Japanese who have occupied Korea during the Second World War, they left. And Korea now was taken over by USSR and USA troops. On the northern side of Korea, USSR was active, and in the southern Korea, USA was active. So the Soviets set up a communist government in the North Korea, and the Americans announced elections in the South Korea. And the border of between North Korea and South Korea was drawn on the 38th parallel. In 1950, North Korea invaded South Korea, so obviously Northern Koreans wanted to spread communism to all over Korea. And this is the signal for USA to start containing communism, to stop North Korea attacking South Korea. So USA could not do it alone, and this was a perfect opportunity to involve the United Nations and to contain communism with the help of United Nations, not just USA. So the United Nations adopted a series of resolutions requiring North Korea to withdraw, calling North Korea an aggressor. This was only possible um, because USSR was boycotting the United Nations, because USSR was not there due to the fact that the newly established China, People's Republic of China, was not accepted to the Security Council of the United Nations. We've spoken about it in the first part of the lesson. Taiwan was recognized in the Security Council, but not People's Republic of China. So, uh, with with the USSR being absent from the Security Council, and the General Assembly of the United Nations made the decision to intervene to help South Korea, but but the United Nations troops that were led, they were led by the American General Douglas MacArthur. So many claim that it was just a tool in the hands of the United States of America. USSR soon returned to the Security Council, and the Chinese joined on the side of the North Korea. So USSR and China became actively involved in supporting North Korea during the Korean War. Why is the Korean conflict significant for the United Nations and for the Cold War history? First of all, UN's reputation. First of all, it stood up to an aggressor. So the North Korea was an aggressor. It invaded South Korea, and the United Nations stood up to it. Unlike the League of Nations, and they were late. If you remember, in the Manchurian crisis when Japan invaded China, they were too late, and Japan left the League, and League was it failed in 1930s. But the United Nations, as opposed to League of Nations, it stood up. Also, the first time that UN forces were deployed to restore peace in another country, it showed that the international cooperation could work if there was no veto, because when USSR was absent, things got quite swiftly because USSR was absent and nobody would block the decision, so it was quite quick. 16 nations fought on the side of the South Korea. Uniting for Peace resolution was passed in the General Assembly, and some nations came to see the UN as a tool of US foreign policy due to Douglas MacArthur's actions. Because if you remember Korean War, I would suggest that please revise from the Cold War book, Superpower Relations. We've studied Korean War, where Douglas MacArthur tried to not only pass the 38th parallel, but he came to the border with China, and he had an intention to continue and to invade China, which would cause an international, probably a third world war. But then Truman dismissed Douglas MacArthur from his position. The third conflict that you have to study and be prepared to compare to other conflicts, whether it's League of Nations conflicts or United Nations conflicts, is Congo. So we have to understand what was the situation in Congo, why there was a conflict. We have to understand how UN was involved in this conflict, and finally the significance of this conflict for the United Nations. Now, conflict in Congo. Congo used to be a Belgian colony until 1960. Majority of countries, African countries, became independent in 1960, as well as Congo. When Congo became independent, thousands of Belgians Instead of leaving the country, they stayed in Congo and kept their privileged positions in the government. So technically, Congo was independent, but who was on power, who was in the government? It was Belgian white people. Firstly, the army mutinied against the Belgian officers and the Congolese new government, Patrice Lumumba. So the army was unhappy about Belgians staying in Congo, and also they disliked the new government of Congo with the headship of Patrice Lumumba. Secondly, they were mostly attacking white population of Congo. Belgium, to of course protect the Belgians, original ethnic Belgians in Congo, they sent in the troops and white Europeans to protect white Europeans, which increased the violence. The local leader, Chombe, he declared the resource-rich province of Katanga independent. So they broke up from Congo and they said that now Katanga is independent. Patrice Lumumba had no other way but to appeal to United Nations for help. Because imagine you are leading a newly established country, you have your army against you, you have Belgium sending troops to protect the white population of your country, and then you've got someone who breaks away and says that now one part of your country is independent. So Lumumba had no choice but to appeal to some authority, and they appealed to United Nations. So UN was involved in Congo. The Secretary General Hammarskjöld, he called a meeting of the Security Council. The UN forces agreed to immediately replace Belgian troops, so that because Belgian troops in Congo, that meant intervening into internal affairs of Congo. But if it would be United Nations forces coming with the legal appeal of Congo to United Nations, it would be relevant. So there were two problems. One was that Katanga region, they rejected the UN peacekeepers, and restoring order in the rest of the Congo became difficult. So they said, we do not accept United Nations peacekeepers in Congo, in Katanga. Katanga blocked itself from the outside, from the rest of the Congo. This led to a military coup by the army commander Mobutu, and Lumumba was caught and murdered. So situation just got out of control. So we have three different groups fighting for power in Congo, and this is a very difficult situation. On the one hand, it's Chombe in Katanga. He's supported by the Belgian troops, and he's keeping the resource-rich Katanga, so it was a very rich region of Congo, independent. Then on the other hand, there's Leopoldville, where Mobutu takes over. He makes a military coup, he takes over the government, and Mobutu's task is to make sure that Katanga is rejoining back Congo. And then there are Lumumba's forces, although he was murdered, but his forces still supported by the USSR. So as you can see, the presence of USSR, this is within the context of the Cold War. USSR also had interests in turning Congo communist. So this is the map where you can see Katanga region. I can show you. This is Katanga with the headship of Chombe, and Katanga was very resource rich and they wanted to keep away from the rest of Congo. You can see Leopoldville and Mobutu's forces, and the aim was to gain back Katanga and reunite Congo. And then you can see Stanleyville, where murdered Lumumba's supporters with the help of USSR's weapons, money, army were located. So situation was very difficult in Congo. So what did UN do in Congo? They launched Operation Rampage. The Congolese in Leopoldville and Stanleyville joined the affair. So the Mobutu's army and Lumumba's supporters, they joined together. UN refused to back down and launched Operation Rampage. in an answer. UN Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld got killed in a plane crash in the Congo. That was, think globally. Um, Secretary General of the Universal Organization, which already existed by that time for 15 years, and its leader got killed in Congo in an accident. So this was a very serious situation. By the end of 1962, um, all mercenaries had left Katanga and Chombe left Congo. So things were getting together. In 1963, Katanga was reunited with the rest of Congo, and in 1964, United Nations forces left Congo. But the success was short lived. The conflict continued between the local forces because Mobutu, the person who was in power, he came with a military coup. So basically, if you look at it, United Nations did a lot of work in Congo, but also in the long term, it wasn't successful because as soon as they left, the conflict continued. Significance of the Congo for the United Nations. So the scale of United Nations being involved in the Congo was unprecedented. 20,000 UN personnel was either way involved in this conflict. The largest UN peacekeeping operation, apart from Korea and Palestine, it was the large UN peacekeeping operation. UN was involved in the internal affairs of a country for the first time. So apart from um, doing the peacekeeping job, UN was involved in the political affairs of the country. This was for the first time. UN forces were proactive due to violence. Use of force was imposed during the conflict in Katanga. So, apart from the other conflicts where United Nations sole responsibility is to protect civilians, to not to be involved in the different fighting sites, in the Congo conflict, they were proactive. They stopped violence. They fought. The UN had taken a strong stance against imperialism. This is the positive side of UN involvement in the Congo. They have stood up to imperialism. They removed Belgian forces. They tried to stop USSR's influence on the country. They wanted to unite Congo and stop the conflict going on. But eventually, in the long term, it wasn't successful because as soon as the United Nations left, the conflict continued. So you have a homework to explain two ways in which the United Nations approach to peacekeeping in Abyssinia was different from its approach in the Congo. So find two differences between the League in Abyssinia and UN in Congo. Find two differences. This is the question worth 6 marks. You don't need to write an essay. You just need 2 paragraphs. In 1 paragraph to explain the role of, to explain the first difference between the League involvement in Abyssinia and UN involvement in Congo, and in the second paragraph, another difference. Yes, and there's the hint here. Think about both nature and circumstances of the two conflicts. I will be waiting for you to submit your answers via email, and I will be posting the homework on the Open School. Thank you very much. Please go extra mile and research about Israeli-Palestinian war. Number 1, Korean War. You can technically you can use your superpower relations book and revise. And Congo conflict. Please research about it and cement your knowledge. Thank you very much. See you soon.